Hi everyone, my name is Amnah. I was the method debate captain in the year 2024 and in the year 2025. I was in the Sri Lankan national pool in the years 2023 and 2024, and I was in the development squad in the year 2024. Okay, so today I'm going to be debriefing the round 3 motion of the Vishaka novice tournament. It's not necessarily full-on arguments, it's just different aspects in which you can look at the motion and understand the motion better. So the motion reads, this house believes that the feminist movement should focus a significant amount of time, platform and resources towards combating benevolent sexism. There's an info slide too. The info slide reads, benevolent sexism as opposed to hostile sexism refers to attitudes about women that are stereotypical yet have positive connotations. For example, men that have an obligation to be chivalrous and protect women, the idealization of women in the role of wife, mother and child caretaker, and the romanticization of emotional sensitivity of women. So I'm going to first go with the proposition case, right? So what I would have said if I were debating this motion in the side of proposition is that benevolent sexism exists as a form to reward women for buying into these sorts of traditional and archetypical roles, right? That is to say that the women that benefit from this sort of benevolent sexism in status quo are the people who the feminist movement wants to encourage to break out of said roles, right? So the environments in which this debate is more likely to take place are in areas in which the feminist movement is relatively muted, right? Where the feminist movement has a capacity to take a passive approach in a safer choice, but is fundamentally unlike the ideals of the feminist movement. All right. So ideally, the goal of the feminist movement is to put women on the same tier and at the same scale as men. The goal is not to shift the power scale 180 degrees, but to equalize these sorts of margins, right? So first, I just want to talk about why inherently the feminist movement should oppose this, right? Because see, the concept of benevolent sexism is to put women on a fake pedestal and to see women as demographically fit to cater to this specific part of society, right? To be chivalrous is to see women dependent on men and to romanticize a sort of emotional sensitivity. This then implies that men are more rational and in proxy logically superior, and therefore this is more likely to deter women from trying to achieve and trying to aim for these sorts of powerful roles in society. And it also makes these roles extremely taboo as well, right? Because see, womanhood roles are now more like they're supposed to encourage these sorts of stereotypes that the patriarchy has built for the sake of putting on this facade of having it rewarded. Therefore, this limits the social influence that women possess on an individual level as well, right? But it's also the idea that most of the concepts of benevolent sexism has a patriarchal undertone even without this sort of explicit misogyny just existing, right? So when you look at like the idea of normalizing it, you can talk about a couple of things, right? The process of normalizing it. Why the feminist movement in itself is the best actor to combat these sorts of benevolent sexism, right? You look at things such as anti-patriarchal ideas, right? But it also, that's the first thing. The second thing that you can look at is in terms of how you're more likely to incentivize women to be more autonomic and try to achieve things for themselves, right? But when you also look at it in terms of things such as resource allocation capacity and so on and so forth, now you're able to prioritize within the moment, prioritize things such as resources and stuff like that, right? Enough to accommodate this sort of choice to pick what you're supposed to combat and what you're not supposed to combat, right? The obligation that you then have here is towards women who aren't in these sorts of autonomic roles and who are actually being victimized through the patriarchy, because they are the most vulnerable people. They are the ones that live in the most conservative societies that suffer day in and day out, right? So now what is the outcome that you would actually gain by allowing these sorts of benevolent sexism to actually foster, right? Benevolent sexism is given towards women by the patriarchy as a reward for this sort of submission. This means that it is perceived at a surface level as something in the disguise of feminism and under the pretense and the facade that this actually exists, right?
This is more likely to put women in a comfort zone and make it harder to distinguish between explicit misogyny and in terms of things such as implicit misogyny, right? The impact of this then is that women in society are incentivized now to stay put and not to do things to challenge these patriarchal norms, which is extremely harmful in the long run, right? But secondly, what would this process actually look like, right? The motion signifies a significant resource allocation, right? This means that you're more likely to now see benevolent sexism as an active threat towards the feminist women supporters, thereby improving the sort of attention paid to these sorts of sexist outlooks, right? So, but also when you look at it in terms of things such as campaigning and social media and etc., you can also think of countering it, because the feminist movement is just there now to encourage women to call out these actions more. The passive nature of benevolent sexism means that you're going to be returning feedback to call-outs, which is unlikely to be blatantly toxic towards women, and in terms of the nature of interaction and so on and so forth. Thus, the counter of this is more likely to be effective, right? But you can also say that you're able to now justify the shift of approach of the feminist movement by saying that status quo has, well established these sorts of feminist ideas as a part of social structure. Thus, the lead to combating these sorts of implicit forms of misogyny is the next step to rooting out sexism as a whole of society, right? Mechanisms that you can use to prove this is in terms of things such as cancel culture, vocal feminism, social media existing, so on and so forth, right? So the underlying point here is that hostile sexism does not need a significant amount of resource allocation in status quo, as in comparison to things such as decades and as when you compare to things such as the amount needed decades and centuries ago, due to things such as like the caution being paid to toxicism and in terms of misogynistic men that just exist in status quo, right? But now I want to talk about why the long term is more likely going to be problematic if you don't combat benevolent sexism now itself, right? Because first of all, in terms of the shift into blatant sexism, despite things such as acceptance of feminism into society, you're more like, and things such as people understanding it, right? You're more likely to now allow these sorts of sexist ideas to foster. This is bad, because this then means that there's a possible backtracking of the feminist work due to the patriarchy still being a very, very powerful actor that exists in status quo. This is harmful because this now disincentivizes women from looking to powerful roles, right? Looking at things such as motherhood roles and so on and so forth, you're more likely to reward these sorts of these traditional archetypes to embrace from women equals to the idea of social perception of those being of higher value. This then means that women are given the incentive to buy into these roles. In the case in which this happens, right, it is extremely problematic towards the feminist movement, because now you're going to be having less women that is going to be going into powerful positions, right, because of the less drive that exists. And also, now the patriarchal opting into this sorts of social backtracking is going to act as a way of combating this sort of anti-misogynistic social narrative that does exist within society, right? The impact of this is that then there is a less amount of women in society in charge to call out misogyny, which is extremely harmful because now you've backtracked on years and years of progress, right? And now the idea of vocalizing feminist ideas is more likely to reduce, therefore leading to lesser crowding around the feminist movement and therefore, a lack of support in general, right? This then means that less influential figures are more likely to support the feminist movement and so on and so forth. And it also means that there's going to be a less amount of funding that you can also gain, right? But in terms of support for the feminist movement, when you think of it, the feminist movement is fighting in terms of, trying to get rid of, taboo topics that exist around them, or like people that think that they don't deserve enough and so on and so forth, right? And basically to prove that everyone deserves a right to choice and freedom and so on and so forth. And these are the ideas of the feminist movement. But it's not just, when you look at other movements that also have the same ideas and ideologies and practices, you can think of other movements such as the LGBTQ movement. This means that because they have the similar amount of the similar end goals to achieve, they have similar ways in which they look at issues, right? Less support for the feminist movement from women in society means that less support from other movements such as the LGBTQ movement and so on, and other movements as well, which is extremely harmful because this then means that on a macro level, the feminist movement is more likely to lose a lot of support and backtrack on everything that they achieve through all these years and basically centuries of hard work and effort that they have put into making the feminist movement what it is in today is more likely to fall back, right? So that's the proposition case that I would have run. Now in terms of the opposition case, right? I just want to point out here for opposition that while benevolent sexism is not entirely harmful, the feminist movement should not, allocate a significant amount of time and platform and resources towards combating it as well. Because doing so constitutes a misprioritization of efforts away from more urgent and more pressing matters that exist within society, right? Because the primary goal of the feminist movement is to secure this sort of tangible equality and a safe spot and safety in general for women, right? And this is important, particularly in areas where hostile sexism continues to have very severe and immediate consequences. What does this look like? This looks like things such as violence, things such as legal discrimination, economic exclusion, so on and so forth, right? And in many contexts and in a vast majority of conservative societies, a vast majority of these issues remain unresolved. And diverting resources towards combating more subtle and culturally embedded forms of sexism risks slowing progress where it is more critically needed, right? Unlike hostile sexism, which produces more direct and measurable harm, benevolent sexism operates in a more abstract sort of space, meaning that prioritizing it doesn't yield the same immediate benefits in terms of improving women's lived realities in general, right? But secondly, what you could also say is that aggressively targeting benevolent sexism risks alienating this sort of potential allies, and like I mentioned before, things such as individuals such as influential people, support that you can get from political parties and other movements such as the LGBTQ movements, right? And undermine the sort of public support that you can get for feminism, right? So many behaviors that are associated with benevolent sexism, things such as chivalry or the value that you have towards caregiving roles, motherhood, and so on and so forth, are deeply ingrained in society and in cultural norms, and they're basically woven into the threads of society. And these are more often than not perceived as positive, as respectful. They're looked at from a very positive eye and a lens in society. Framing these behaviors as harmful can now make the movement look overly critical, right? But what it also does is it disconnects the movement from everyday experiences, which then in turn leads to the backlash towards the feminist movement, but it also reduces things such as border appeal that exists. This is bad. Why? This weakens the feminist movement's ability to mobilize support. This then takes away resources from urgent causes, and what this also means is that aspects of benevolent sexism that provide very short-term benefits and very practical benefits, such as things such as social recognition for things such as caregiving labor, or for things such as protective norms in certain contexts, are now or for these particular norms, when you remove these, the amount of attention you give these without adequate structural alternatives, right? It's going to leave a vast majority of women overlooked and worse off, right? But thirdly, as women gain greater access to things such as education, things such as economic independence, political power, and so on and so forth, the amount of stretch that you can get for these things such as traditional gender roles and extension of benevolent sexism is more likely to diminish organically over time. Therefore, it is more strategic for the feminist movement to focus the limited amount of resources that it has on combating hostile sexism and achieving this sort of structural change, allowing more subtle forms of biases to erode over time and down the line, rather than prioritizing them right now at the expense of more pressing issues that exist. That is what I would have ideally debated for proposition and opposition. I believe the motion and the info site both will be attached in the description. Thank you for listening, and I hope you understood.